Now is time for our last speech. I'm very pleased to welcome here in Dubai Professor Dr. Kamran Ahmed from the Trobe University, Australia. And his speech is called Ownership Structure, Corporate Governance and Voluntary Disclosure, a Review of Studies. Professor Dr. Kamran Ahmed is a professor of accounting and finance in Trobe Business School. He was head of School of Accounting from 2006 till 2010. Professor Ahmed began his academic career in Australia in 1988 at an Australian National University, and later had academic appointments in Victoria University of Wellington and the University of New England prior to joining Trobe University in 1999. He had visiting appointments at the University of British Columbia, Exeter University, the University of Houston, and Monash University.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'd like to express my gratitude for inviting me by Dr. Kashan to share with you my research. The paper that I'm going to talk with you, it's not a paper based on just data. It's a review paper. Review paper is very interesting in the sense that you can have opportunities to contribute to the literature. In this paper, I'm going to show you what's the current state of corporate governance literature, ownership structure, does it have any role to play in terms of voluntary disclosure. So the voluntary disclosure is an interesting issue. The first study that when I started my PhD, I worked on corporate disclosure, and 1961, the first paper was published in Accounting Review. That's the seminal paper by Sir. So that got me interested in that voluntary disclosure area, and over the last so many years, I'm still interested, and I'm doing some research. The review studies, as far as I can understand, you can do it in two ways. One approach is to discuss what's the current state of literature, what's the trend, what we have learned so far out of so many studies published, because different studies gives different results. I'm talking about empirical papers. So empirical papers, different papers give different results, and it depends on different context, how you measure your empirical context, how you measure dependent variable, how you measure independent variables, all these things, and at the end, you come up with so many different results, and that gets you confused. When you do a paper, you have to write literature review, and you have to tell where the literature gap is there, what we don't know. If we don't contribute in that respect, find the niche and find the gap, obviously, as Professor Danturi said, and also Professor Moin said, that we have to make some contribution. No journals will accept, even if it is not a good journal, even low-grade journal would like to see some contribution to the literature. So the review studies is one way of looking at where the gap is, what has not been done, and if there are so many papers giving mixed signals, mixed results, how you can improve, whether it's due to some statistical problem, or whether the research design was said differently. So that gives you an idea and gives you an opportunity to contribute and also improve the methodological deficiencies. So review type of studies can be done two ways, as I said earlier. One is exclusively quantitative, because those who do quantitative review studies, they say that discursive review studies doesn't give enough insight. So I have done both types of research. I've done meta-analysis, some of you are familiar with, and I've been quite successful in that area. The first study on voluntary disclosure I published in 1999, that was in British Accounting Review, and I find that I'm quite pleased to know that it's been cited still, so after so many years, and it is one of the highly cited paper. So review study paper contributes a lot, and it also gets a lot of citation and makes you quite, happy in the sense that you know that your work has been recognized by, upcoming researchers and doctoral students. Right? So let's go to that. Rather than talking about how we did the review, just have a quick look what we did. In this paper, this is written exclusively for this conference. I'm not planning to submit to a journal at this stage unless it is considered by Dr. Pirzada for his journal. So that's one we reviewed, because as I said earlier, voluntary disclosure is so important and it's so interesting area. Over so many years, 30 years, lots of work have been done. So we reviewed 72 papers. Okay, 72 papers, voluntary disclosure, effect of ownership structure, effect of corporate governance structure. So what we have found is written quite nicely here to just a gist, and I'll talk about the process, how we proceeded. So we find that voluntary disclosure is affected by ownership structure. Ownership structure is not just one single concept. Ownership structure comes in different shape, a different format, different identity. Owners can be state, ownership can be a foreign ownership, foreign investors, institutional owners. Institutional owners have a positive effect, while ownership, when it is concentrated, it has negative impact on a voluntary disclosure. Okay, better quality governance, such as board independence, board size, and existence of audit committee has a positive effect, and CEO duality has a negative effect on voluntary disclosure. However, such relationship is affected by variable definition. So how voluntary disclosure have been defined, both independent, and research context used by researchers. So it has an impact. Regulator should consider the ownership structure doesn't have a unidirectional impact. It should be looked at the context. It should be looked at how voluntary disclosure was defined, how ownership was defined in order to develop some policies. It is not one size fits well type here. So what is voluntary disclosure? As we know, it is over and above the mandatory disclosure requirements. So some firms choose to disclose more information when it is not required. Why firms choose to disclose information? If you look at the studies that we have reviewed, 72, the dominant literature, as you can see, the agency theory and contexting cost theory have been used mostly. Legitimacy theory, political economic theory, signaling theory, stakeholder theory. So as Professor Danturi says, we have to have any type of research has to have some theoretical underpinning. Okay, why you expect something to happen? Okay, why is positive? You are expecting positive. Why you are expecting negative? Why you are approaching a null hypothesis, or why you are approaching for a directional hypothesis? It has to be guided by strong literature. And as you can see, other theories in recent years, I've seen some papers using resource dependency theory, power theory, institutional theory. Danturi has discussed a lot, and institutional theory has also been employed. Most early studies focused on firm-specific attributes. So what I have found, until 1985, 90s, most of the voluntary disclosure studies focused on firm-specific characteristics, whether the firm is small, firm is big, what type of audit farm, audit the farm, whether it's profitable or not, whether farms are listed or not. So, but the focus has changed nowadays. So if you are really relying on farm-specific characteristics, that's not going to take you further. The research has changed its focus, its direction, and now corporate governance is an important element in explaining voluntary disclosure, and ownership structure has come into place as well. So ownership structure is not a particular concept. It has to be expanded. What type of ownership? Is it a state ownership? Is it the institutional ownership? Or is it ownership comes from foreign Western countries, investors? What type of investors are there? Okay, so that are the primary, these are the characteristics people are looking at. Okay, so what do we know? Generally, we have found a positive relationship between high-quality governance mechanism and voluntary disclosure. But the relationship between ownership structure and voluntary disclosure is not clear, as the empirical results are mixed. So we did a quantitative study. It's published in Australian Journal of Management just this year, but that was very much quantitative. We used meta-analysis. In this paper, I am not using meta-analysis technique to show you where the literature stands. It will be quite descriptive to give you an idea who has found what, okay? And to give you an idea what are the gaps there. In a recent paper by Brown, probably most of you know Philip Brown. He has written a review paper published in Australian Accounting and Finance. He reviewed different types of papers on corporate governance, and he found that corporate governance literature has given us mixed findings. It's shown mixed findings because we don't know what is as such corporate governance. What do we mean by good quality corporate governance? Is it board independence? Is it the board size? Is it the CEO duality? All this measurement. It's not. He's saying that different researchers have used different techniques and different dependent variable, different independent variable, and the different econometric techniques has provided mixed results. Okay? So now we have to really come up with a strong theory to explain our finding. And also, before that, there is a paper by Baer et al. And published in Journal of Accounting and Economics. What is a very, very important paper, those who are interested in corporate disclosure type literature. And they have found that different studies have used different contexts. So it's quite a big paper, about 55 pages. So if you have the opportunity, read that paper. It will give you good guidance. Those who are interested to write new papers or even starting a PhD, that gives you an idea where the literature gaps are there. Okay, now ownership structure, what do we mean? Ownership concentration. In most of the developing emerging countries, we say the ownership structure is highly concentrated. Therefore, in emerging countries, firms don't disclose. So why firms don't disclose when ownership is highly concentrated? We know there are incentives. Why, when there is ownership concentrated, why firms don't disclose? Because they don't have that incentive. It comes from agency theory. Ownership dispersion in most developed countries, the ownership is dispersed. So agency cost is higher as well. Therefore, incentive to have positive in order to reduce agency cost. If you look at that original hypothesis, that ownership dispersion leads to higher disclosure. Foreign ownership most of the authors have showed that positive or expected positive relationship. Institutional ownership expected to have a positive relationship. State government ownership, sometimes authors have expected positive relationship, some authors expected negative relationship. Depends also what type of this voluntary disclosure you are looking at. Governance structure, most of the researchers use board composition. What is board composition? We know what is the percentage of independent director. That's one of the most important proxies for board composition. And higher the independent director, we consider that the board is of better quality. But that depends also on whether this is necessarily true. Okay, depends on the effectiveness of independent director. Board size, positive, negative, CEO duality, expected negative, audit committee positive. Now, with respect to voluntary disclosure, out of the 72 papers, we have found some use total voluntary disclosures and use different types of items. And I've seen from 5 items to even 86 items, right? So 86 items, from 5 items to 86 items, huge number of different, okay? So total voluntary disclosure, there are many studies that looked at social and environmental disclosure, okay? It's not mandatory, it's voluntary in most countries, and why firms decide to voluntarily disclose social and environmental information, okay? So that is guided by different type of theory. Intellectual capital disclosure, I've seen few papers published on intellectual capital disclosure, internet-based disclosure. So as you can see, there are a number of ways researchers have used voluntary disclosure to implement the study. How measured? How voluntary disclosures are measured? Some authors use index-based, okay? What is the number of studies they expect, and what is the number of studies this disclose, okay? So, and the proportion. So the dependent variables become the proportion, the maximum number of items you expect, and the actual number of items disclosed by companies. Or some other measures like just item. I expect these must be disclosed, these number of items must be disclosed as per the regulation, as per the expectation, and if it is not, then the company has not disclosed properly. Okay, how independent variables are measured? Ownership concentration, most of the studies, percentage of shares owned by substantial shareholders. Family ownership, whether it's a family farm or non-family farm, that's ownership concentration is measured by, in this way, about 80–85% of the studies, percentage of shares owned by substantial owners or percentage of shares owned by family members. Most of the studies I've seen in Indonesia and Malaysia use family ownership as the explanatory variable for ownership concentration. Ownership dispersion, percentage of shares held by individuals. Okay, how ownership is dispersed, and some authors use dummy variables, some authors use percentage of shares held by individuals. So it is, as you see, it is expected to have opposite direction as far as voluntary disclosure is concerned. If it is highly dispersed, we expect the disclosure will be higher. If it is highly concentrated, we expect disclosure level should be lower. And foreign, managerial, institutional, and state ownership, both sides CEO duality are consistently measured. About 72 papers that we have reviewed, everybody come up with very similar type of measurement. So what we have done in this review paper, we search from 1993 to 2013. Why 1993? There are some papers now questioning why some authors use certain number of years. I picked up, or my sample is from 2008 to 2010. Why 2010? Why 2008? Okay, there is no explanation. Even big journals, most of the authors didn't provide explanation why they have done that. In my case, in this paper, we found out that, as I said earlier, the trend has changed. Most papers are now using ownership and corporate governance. Authors are not using anymore farm level characteristics. Farm level characteristics are used for control variable, not necessarily focus variable or experimental variable. Okay, so 86 we had to exclude few papers because studies have limited information, other measures of disclosure, corporate governance variables not included in our analysis. So we could not really use this type of papers. So we come up with 72 papers. And as you can see, all these papers listed here, and different countries all over the world, Switzerland, cross-country studies, New Zealand, France, Hong Kong, you see, Germany, Czech Republic, China, Germany, and how they have number of farms, how many farms they've measured in the sample, reporting years, and disclosure proxy, how disclosure was proxied, and the independent variable. That's overall ownership concentration, ownership dispersion, as you can see, all these explanatory variables. And what you can see, so this is NS, there's no significant results. There's a negative one, and you can see a positive. So ownership dispersion, some has found no difference, no result, no significant difference, and one is negative, voluntary disclosure, ownership dispersion negative, positive. So as you can see, there are differences in results. So it gives you mixed findings. So where to go? If you review the paper, how can you tell, okay, ownership dispersion has definitely a positive impact on voluntary disclosure, when some studies have found negative, some has positive, some has no significant. So if you have reviewed 3 papers, one is positive, one is negative, and the other is none. So how can you really review and tell something to the next, the group of researchers that the research is going there? Okay, so that's the problem. Most of these studies have this problem, review paper particularly. So you have to come up with some interpretation. One problem with this type of that you can't really tell clearly what's going on because you can't quantify. So another option is to quantify the analysis. So table 2 is all these studies, one after another, so 72 papers. So we studied in detail all these papers and gives you an idea who has found what. Okay, so quite substantial paper in that respect. What considering, if you have time, read this paper. To those who are interested in this type of literature, have good idea who has done what over so many years. Okay, that's a good literature review. So let us show you the summary. Oh, sorry. Can we go? Okay, thank you. So what we did, give you a summary. Positive association, ownership concentration 6, negative association 21, and non-significant 5. ownership dispersion, there are positive, negative, and 2, non-significant. Foreign ownership, generally foreign ownership is a positive impact on voluntary disclosure. You know that government ownership 14-0, some expected negative there, and some expected, you see, but there is no significant. If you can see government ownership, what we have found, most of the studies use social and environmental disclosure to define voluntary disclosure, and state-owned enterprise disclose more voluntary disclosure in the form of social and environmental disclosure. So you can see there is definite trend. The state-owned enterprise disclose more in social and environmental because they want to show that, you know, their environment is more sensitive, and they're reluctant to disclose more financial type of items, okay? Institutional ownership, as you can see, there is a trend that is a positive relationship, because negative relationship nobody has found. And you see, management ownership, you expect negative, and studies have shown that negative 8, and also some studies, nearly equal number of studies, found no significant difference. So this will give you an overall idea about who has found what, and there is also the mixed findings. Audit quality, as you can see, 13 positive, and nobody has found negative. So it's suggesting that better audit quality, the audit effectiveness of audit quality is quite a positive in terms of disclosure, voluntary disclosure. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Yeah, so that gives you an idea about the current state of literature. Okay, thank you.
I thank you, Professor Dr. Kamran Ahmed, for another very interesting presentation.